beginning of the First World War, the Royal Navy had many antiquated ships that Admiral Jackie Fisher, during his first tenure as First Sea Lord, had wanted to scrap to help reduce the cost of the Navy. In addition, it would help modernize the Royal Navy, as they wouldn't have so many elderly ships on the roster. However, some would not be scrapped. Instead, they would be put into the reserve fleet, essentially being in limbo. Important to our story would be the Bacanti class, or Cressy class, laid down in 1898 and 1899. These 12,000-ton armored cruisers could originally make 21 knots, being armed with a variety of 9.2 and 6-inch guns and other weapons. There would be 6 ships in the class: the Cressy, the Sultaj, Aboukir, Hogue, Bacanti, and Euryalus. These ships would be brought back into service at the outset of the Great War, being crewed by Royal Navy Reserves, Fleet Reserves, and Navy pensioners, many of whom were middle-aged family men. The old Cressy class, like other reserve ships, were local ships, with most of their crews coming from local villages. To compensate for the inexperience of the crews, the ships would be assigned regular Navy captains and officers. In addition, each ship would be allotted 9 young cadets from the Royal Navy College at Dartmouth. They would be part of the first submarine disaster of the First World War. Since these ships were so elderly and slow, it was not deemed correct to have them operate with the Grand Fleet. Instead, they were assigned to patrol the Broad 14s, which is a patch of the southern part of the North Sea off the Dutch coast, named for the latitude it sits on. Cressy, Bacanti, Aboukir, Hogue, and Euryalus would be based out of Harwich to support Commodore Tyrwhitt's destroyers, as well as Commodore Keyes' submarines, in blocking any German surface force attempting to attack transports carrying the British Expeditionary Force to the continent. As there was frequent bad weather, it meant that the Cressys, who could handle the rough seas much better than the smaller vessels, became frontline units. The ships would patrol the Broad 14s day after day, not taking breaks and taking turns to coal. As the calendar turned to fall, the seas would get worse, and any accompanying destroyers would return to port. Not only that, but the cruisers could not stick to their orders. They were to maintain 15 knots and zigzag occasionally. With the aged machinery, it was impossible to maintain 15 knots. Rear Admiral Arthur Christian, who was in charge of the Cressys, considered himself lucky if 3 of his 5 cruisers could make 13 knots. They would also use an extreme amount of coal, so they'd typically go at a sluggish pace of 12 knots, which dropped to a lethargic 9 knots. The cruisers would not zigzag, as no one had ever spotted a periscope. Keyes and Tyrwhitt would understand the danger that these antiquated vessels posed to their crews. In writing a letter on August 21st, 1914, to Rear Admiral Sir Arthur Leveson, director of the Admiralty's Operations Division, Keyes writes, "Think of what will happen if 2 or 3 well-trained German cruisers fall in with those Bacantis. How can they be expected to shoot straight or have any confidence in themselves when they know they are untrained and can't shoot? Why give the Germans the smallest chance of a cheap victory and improve morale? For heaven's sake, take those Bacantis away. The Germans must know that they are about, and if they send out a suitable force, God help them." Although worrying about the threat from fast-moving surface ships, even Keyes, who was the Commodore for submarines, didn't worry about the threat submarines could pose. On the 17th of September, the fears of Tyrwhitt and Keyes would reach the highest levels in a meeting on board the flagship of the Grand Fleet, Iron Duke. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, encouraged the rather junior Commodores to speak up about their fears when it came to the so-called live bait squadron, as some in the Grand Fleet called the Cressys. Churchill would recommend that they be withdrawn, and Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, Admiral Jellicoe, would agree, while Admiral Sturdy, Chief of the Naval Staff, would argue that a squadron would need to patrol the Broad 14s. Nevertheless, the following day, Churchill sent a memo to First Sea Lord Prince Louis of Battenberg, stating that the Bacanti should not continue to patrol that area, to which Battenberg agreed and told Sturdy to make the necessary orders to have this accomplished. Although Sturdy agreed that the Cressys were old and slow and should be replaced by the new Arethusa class of light cruisers, however, only one had been delivered to the Navy, so Sturdy persuaded Battenberg that the Cressys were better than nothing in heavy weather when the destroyers had to be withdrawn. With that, on the 19th, Battenberg approved an order to have the elderly cruisers remain on patrol and remain there until the 22nd of September, when disaster would strike. Before we continue our story on the Cressy-class cruisers, we should discuss the U-boat that would create the disaster. U-9 would be one of 14 early kerosene-burning submarines built for the Kaiserliche Marine. Being 188 feet long, displacing around 493 tons, with 2 bow torpedo tubes and 2 stern tubes, the craft would sail with 4 officers and 24 men. Like other U-boats, U-9 would go to sea with their tubes loaded and 2 reserve torpedoes. The captain of U-9 would be 32-year-old Otto Weddigen. Weddigen was known for being courteous and athletic, and for being quite serious about submarines and dispelling the common misconception that they were just iron coffins. By 1914, Weddigen commanded a U-boat and carefully began training his crew in a mock-up submarine on land. When the crew was ready, they began testing the limits of their submarine and themselves, diving below the normal operational depth and remaining at sea in poor weather, both underwater and on the surface. His crew practiced reloading their torpedoes at sea, trundling forward the two reserve torpedoes hanging from the overhead rails and sliding them into the empty bow tubes. Weddigen's crew soon became one of the most elite units in the Kaiserliche Marine. When the war came, Weddigen's first wartime assignment was to patrol part of the North Sea west of the Frisian Islands between Borkum and Heligoland. Still, due to engine trouble, they had to return to Wilhelmshaven. Later in September, U-9 was to attack British landing transports at Ostend. However, due to poor weather, Weddigen's U-boats did not leave until 5 a.m. on the 20th of September. The awful weather didn't subside. With a rising northwest wind and heavy swells, it made the ship's gyro compass useless, being forced to navigate by soundings. The little U-boat was battered by 10-foot waves. Weddigen and his crew would ride out the storm on the surface, just keeping the bow into the waves. Not certain where he was, Weddigen turned south towards the Dutch coast in an attempt to reach the English Channel by getting a bearing from a point on land. On the 21st, he would locate himself by a Dutch seaside resort some 50 miles off course. Stopping to conserve his electric motors and charge his batteries, he would take U-9 50 feet down, and that was where U-9 would spend the night. On the morning of the 22nd, U-9 had traveled almost 200 miles, and Weddigen had decided to turn back for home. When after going down from the conning tower for breakfast, Weddigen's first officer spotted smoke on the horizon. Previously on the night of the 17th, when the Cressys were patrolling the Broad 14s, seas would become rough, leaving the old armored cruisers to their own devices without any destroyers to screen them. At 6 a.m. on the 20th, the patrol was reduced to 3 cruisers when Euryalus went to Harwich to coal. Rear Admiral Christian, who would normally transfer his flag to another ship, was prevented by rough seas, so commander of the 3 Cressys transferred to the senior-most captain, John Drummond of Aboukir. The 3 ships would continue their patrol through the rough seas, but the weather was starting to lift by the 22nd, so Commodore Tyrwhitt would wait until 5 a.m. on the 22nd to leave with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers to reinforce the cruisers on the Broad 14s. The journey would take only around 4 hours. Meanwhile, at periscope depth, Weddigen watched 3 ships come over the horizon, steaming 4,000 yards apart. After seeing that they were just 3 ships on patrol, U-9 prepared to attack, steering for the middle ship of the 3, approaching the target's port bow, moving in close to make sure his aim was true. At 6:20 a.m., Weddigen launched his torpedo and then dived to 50 feet. 1 minute and 30 seconds later, a torpedo hit Aboukir amidships on the starboard side below the waterline. Water would begin to flood engine spaces and boiler rooms, bringing the cruiser to a stop. Seeing no signs of a submarine, Drummond on the bridge assumed his ship had hit a mine. He hoisted the mine warning signal and ordered the other 2 cruisers to come closer so that he could transfer wounded men. Aboukir would begin to list heavily, with attempts to right her by flooding compartments on the opposite side failing. It soon became clear that the ship would sink. When the abandoned ship order came, only 1 boat was available. The others had been smashed up in the explosion or could not be swung out and lowered for the lack of steam power to the winches. 25 minutes after she was hit, Aboukir capsized, floating for 5 minutes bottom up, tempting a few seamen to scramble aboard her bottom and cling to the keel. When she sank, she took those men with her. Captain Wilmot Nicholson of Hogue soon realized that he was dealing with a submarine, signaling Cressy to watch out for a periscope. Even though he was worried about submarines, Nicholson slowed to help the men in the water, throwing overboard mess tables, chairs, and anything that would float. Then they would stop and lower boats. As Aboukir was going down at around 6:55, there would be 2 tremendous crashes, 5 seconds apart. Hogue had now been hit by 2 torpedoes from U-9. Weddigen, aboard U-9, was surprised when he struck Aboukir that it wasn't a light cruiser like he initially thought, but instead a large armored cruiser. Not only that, but he saw 2 sister ships slowly moving through the water. With that, the crew reloaded his empty tubes and selected Hogue as the ship was stationary only 300 yards away. Taking no chances, Weddigen would fire both bow tubes. The force of the 2 torpedoes leaving the tubes caused such a large shift in weight distribution that it caused the submarine to become unbalanced and her bow rose above the surface. Hogue's gunners took immediate action and opened fire. U-9 struggled to regain ballast, but Weddigen was able to take the ship back down to 50 feet. And that's when, at 6:55, the 2 explosions could be heard from Hogue. Hogue would go the same way as Aboukir. Even with orders to close watertight doors, it was to no avail, as within 5 minutes the quarterdeck was awash and the cruiser rolled to starboard, with another explosion being heard deep within the ship. Captain Nicholson would give the order to abandon ship 10 minutes after she was hit. Hogue capsized and sank at 7:15, just as her boats were returning with survivors from Abu Qir. Weddigen, with his electric batteries running low, still elected to continue his attack, having 2 torpedoes in his stern tube and 1 reserve in his bow tubes. After rising to periscope depth and surveying the destruction, Weddigen maneuvered so his stern was aimed at Cressy, and at 7:20 he fired both stern torpedoes. The range was about 1,000 yards. Soon, they only heard 1 dull thud, instead of the 2 he had launched. U-9 maneuvered quickly to 550 yards and fired her last torpedo. Aboard Cressy, they had been sending out a message to the Admiralty about Abu Qir and Hogue sinking. But about 5 minutes later, a periscope was seen on the starboard quarter. With the torpedo in the water, Captain Robert Johnson ordered full speed ahead both. As Cressy was at a standstill and couldn't gather momentum, she would soon be hit and heeled about 10 degrees to starboard and then momentarily righted herself. Still soon after, at 7:30, the 3rd torpedo Weddigen had fired struck home on the port beam, rupturing tanks in a boiler room and smothering men in scalding steam. Cressy would roll over and float bottom up for about 20 minutes and then go down at 7:55 a.m. Cressy's boats had been away picking up survivors from her sister ships, and soon survivors from Cressy were clamoring to climb aboard the already crowded boats and anything that was floating in the water. There were Dutch fishing trawlers nearby, but having seen the explosions and the ships go down, the Dutch would hesitate. Eventually, at 8:30 a.m., a small steamship from Rotterdam, the Flora, would arrive on scene and rescue 286 men. Another steamer, the Titan, would rescue 147 men. Along with that, 2 small British trawlers would save more men. Eventually, Tyrwhitt would arrive on scene at 10:45 a.m., coming alongside an English trawler loaded with men. Later, he recalled, "They looked just like rows and rows of swallows on telegraph lines, all huddled together to keep themselves warm. They were all naked or nearly so." 4 of Tyrwhitt's destroyers would begin to take survivors on board, while the other 4 began to hunt for the U-boat. Of those on board the 3 armored cruisers, 837 men would make it back to Harwich, wrapped in blankets with their hair and bodies soaked in oil. However, 62 officers and 1,397 men had drowned. Weddigen and his crew would make it back to Wilhelmshaven on the 24th, where Weddigen became the first naval hero of the war, being awarded the Iron Cross First Class, and the Iron Cross Second Class went to every member of U-9's crew. In Great Britain, the bombshell that a single 493-ton U-boat sank 3 armored cruisers could not be believed. The Times stated, "It is well known that the German submarines operate in flotillas of 6 boats. If it is true that only 1 U-9 returned to harbor, we may assume the others are lost." Even though the loss of life was great and the blow to prestige was great, practically speaking, the loss of 3 old armored cruisers was not going to affect the overwhelming superiority of the Royal Navy. Following this attack, Euryalus and Bacanti were sent away to Gibraltar to be far away from U-boats. Admiral Christian was removed from command and placed on half pay. Also, large ships needed to zigzag at 13 knots in submarine waters, and a command from the Admiralty reads as follows: "If one ship is torpedoed or strikes a mine, the disabled ship must be left to her fate, and other large ships clear out of the dangerous area, calling up minor vessels to render assistance," which is something we discussed in detail in the video on the loss of HMS Audacious. Although this was the first U-boat disaster, more would follow, with the sinking of the even older Edgar-class vessel that was patrolling off Aberdeen. These sinkings would cause a change in the view of the submarine. No longer were they seen as toys or playthings, but as a serious threat to the dominance of the Royal Navy. I hope you all have enjoyed this look at the first submarine disaster in the First World War. Please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow.